already, and she's a great character as well. We will talk to her later on as well. But now at 8 minutes past 7, we start with Donald Trump, where he's been addressing the Republican convention in Milwaukee as he returned to the stage for the first time since that attempt on his life at a rally last weekend.
I started to, like this, turn to my right and was ready to begin a little bit further turn, which I'm very lucky I didn't do, when I heard a loud whizzing sound and felt something hit me really, really hard on my right ear. I said to myself, wow, what was that? It can only be a bullet. And moved my right hand to my ear, brought it down. My hand was covered with blood.
Well, we've been speaking to Jacob Rubashkin, who's a journalist who's at the convention there and followed the speech in Wisconsin.
The events of this past weekend and the way that Trump began his address, going into such great length about the shooting, really did put a damper on the entire speech. Obviously, he was much more quiet than he normally is. But then for the rest of the speech, which much more closely resembled the typical stump speech that he gives at rallies across the country, he was still less energetic than he has been in the past. And quite frankly, as the speech dragged on into its second hour and approaching the 90-minute mark, delegates on the floor were getting restless, checking their phones, some headed for the exits. I think that there was a more subdued feeling in the audience than what we have seen at some rallies in the past.
Well, let's speak to Erol Morkoc from Republicans Overseas. Thank you for joining us. What do you make of that upsum from Jacob there, saying that an hour and a half, that is a long time to speak?
It certainly was a long time to speak, and I think the attitude was a little bit subdued because he had just overcome an assassination attempt recently. However, the other way of looking at it was Trump spoke calmly, he spoke slowly, and that isn't something you usually see from Trump. That sort of energetic, gung-ho style was replaced with a much more classically presidential posturing. And in a sort of true event that fate likes irony, Donald Trump turned his head to look at a chart of illegal immigration. So illegal immigration saved Donald Trump's life, and he was able to bring that chart back up on the stage and say, I finally got a chance to look at this chart. So from our perspective, we definitely thought that Trump did well. Obviously, a 90-minute speech from anybody is a bit excessive. I would wonder if Joe Biden would be able to give a 90-minute speech after sitting in a room for 4 hours listening to other people talk. But that's neither here nor there. It definitely was, a great moment for Donald Trump to come out. He had a commanding presence. He told the story that he said he's only going to tell one time regarding his experience on that stage with that horrific attack. And I think all in all, it was a much more, let's go with presidential style of speaking rather than his traditional stump speech rally style. And while that might have lost that other gentleman's attention, it certainly didn't lose the attention of the Republican voters who definitely appreciated what Trump had to say.
And do you think that will appeal to a different demographic?
I do. I definitely do. He took a moment to talk to the families of the people who were killed at his event, especially the fireman who was. And so, he definitely was able to reach out in a general sense, in a human sense. And I think anybody who's undecided or on the fence right now could not look at that speech and see anything other than a positive message. Trump was a unifier. He wasn't banging his fist and shouting like President Biden has been doing recently. He was calm, he was collected, he was measured, and I think that's sort of what he needs to project. And honestly, anybody who's has a life-altering event or near-death experience probably will be a little bit different after that. And as gloomy as the circumstances, it might be a good thing for President Trump to change his rhetoric and be a little bit more inclusive, which he didn't have to do. He had an opportunity to become one of the most polarizing figures and to take that and come out with a vengeance. And rather, he came with a message of unity. He said, I want to be the president for all America, because being president for 50% of America isn't enough. And even though this country is split 50-50, that message, I think, will resonate, especially with immigrants, with African Americans and Hispanics, and a lot of the new contingent in the big tent party that Donald Trump has built. And if you look at people like J.D. Vance, who were never Trumpers, who are now his vice president, it just goes to show you the level of forgiveness that Donald Trump has, that perhaps he didn't have before. And I think it's a great message.
And there is a certain energy, there is a real optimism within the Republican Party at the moment. Seeing him on stage with his family, Donald Trump, it almost looked like a presidential acceptance speech. But we're hearing this morning, the New York Times is reporting that President Biden is seriously considering his future re-election bid because of the mounting criticism from within his party. Does it put Republicans slightly on edge that he may be replaced in the coming weeks?
I think on the surface, yes, of course, because who wouldn't want to run against Joe Biden? We would love to go up against him. However, ultimately, I think that Joe Biden, you have to keep in mind, there is no family business for the Bidens. When Joe Biden's done, that's it. That the grift is over. There's nothing to go back on. So for him to step down and actually hand that power over, well, the odds makers certainly have changed their tune. He still hasn't done it. I think an open convention in the Democrat Party would be a very interesting thing to see. There definitely are candidates who we would, have a maybe more difficult time against versus Joe Biden. But ultimately, I don't believe that Joe Biden stepping down or not stepping down will decide how this election goes. I think Donald Trump is in the pole position, and he's going to, calmly and measuredly come to that finish line and be victorious, regardless of who he faces.
He does appear to be in a strong position, but which Democratic candidate is the Republicans' greatest fear, would you say?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would say there's a man by the last name of Shapiro who would be a strong vice president candidate to either Kamala or Gavin Newsom. I mean, Gavin Newsom is a much more competent person. The Democrats have an issue where the campaign finance laws might require them to not be able to use the money they raise with Joe Biden unless they use Mrs. Harris, which, puts her in an interesting situation. She's the most beatable, but the person probably we're most worried about would be some sort of Gavin Newsom ticket, because he does have a great look about him and he looks presidential, and that's kind of half the game in America. It's a bit of a show. So that's where we see it.
And in terms of the assassination attempts on Mr. Trump's life, to what extent do you think it's changed the tone of this election campaign? There have been accusations of toxicity in the language on both sides. Do you see that being dialed down in future politics? Oh, have we lost him?
That's to dial it down.
Sorry, Errol, we lost you for a moment there.
Oh, I was just saying that I don't believe that things are going to dial down, really, at least from the left. They've continued to say that he's a threat to democracy. They've continued to say he's an existential threat to the Constitution. They've called him essentially Hitler for the last 10 years. And so for them to now say, oh, let's dial it back, all we ever said was, lock her up and things like that. Sure, was that divisive? Yes. But did we go so far as to take shots at congressmen like they did in 2017, or firebomb the Trump campaign offices in 2016, or try to assassinate the president and this year? No, our party isn't about that. So it's going to come from the left. If they want to use this dehumanizing rhetoric and the Russia, agent of Putin, these kind of propagandist terms that inspire lunatics, I don't know what we can do on our side besides just continue doing what we're doing.
You cannot necessarily say that it's the fault of the presidential candidate.
Well, I certainly believe that it's a fault of Joe Biden for dehumanizing President Trump, for saying that he's literally an agent of Putin, for saying that he's literally going to destroy your democracy. If these are true things and you're an ardent follower of the Democrat Party, you might find it to be totally within your right to go and try to kill Hitler, which is what has happened. We never, ever used that kind of language. We never tried to devalue a person like they.
Okay,
Trump.
I mean, many would argue that Donald Trump has devalued women in many ways, so that there's a lot to be said from both sides, isn't there? Perhaps it's not being dialed down then.
I don't think that there's a comparison to Donald Trump's comments and people saying that he's literally Hitler and then trying to assassinate him. I don't think those are on the same table. Yes, Donald Trump has divisive rhetoric in a political sense, but not in a sense that led to this kind of violence. Our side doesn't do the violence. They do the violence.
Okay.
Track record shows that.
Okay, I'm sure Democratic Party would argue that they weren't directly responsible for the violence that has been shown. Thank you so much for your time this morning. It's coming up to 7:20.
If you want to respond to what